All right, welcome to the trust ecology presentation. Conservation has a trust problem and what we need to know as conservation practitioners. Here you go. What is trust? Trust is a lot of things. Simply, it is an individual's willingness to accept vulnerability or being exposed to the possibility of being harmed in the face of uncertainty. It is conceived of as an attitude rather than a behavior. As an attitude, trust is a multi-level relationship of characteristics between a truster and a trustee. A tripart relationship where truster A trusts truster B to perform action C. The emphasis is on the willingness to do an action, not that the action is done. This trust is built on the positive experiences of trustworthiness and vulnerability to the actions of the trustee, regardless of the ability to monitor the trustee's behaviors. Those positive experiences being the function of the trustee's integrity, ability, and benevolence. Trust is a necessary part of our work. It has a strong influence on the relationships we have with those that we work with and those that we serve. Conservationists operate within this interactive and cyclical role with a shared motivation for sustaining commitment and collaboration. It's multidimensional. Trust is made of many components, and these different forms of trust have effects on collaborative outcomes. Trust is crucial for better relationships that reduce biodiversity loss. Willingness to accept and resist conservation initiatives is also reliant on whether initiatives are perceived as morally just, in which trust plays a major role. Trust is an abstract and context-dependent concept that underscores much of the basic parts of our social relationships. It's an attitude where people accept vulnerability based on positive expectations of others. This attitude is developed over time and is an important driver of collaboration, which reduces harmful conflict by building relationships through shared knowledge and values. Now, let's look at the multiple types of trust that exist within the conservation space. We don't have time to go through all of them, but if we pick out 2 or 3, we can discuss how these types of trusts work in conservation. First, we have confidence-based trust. We also have dispositional trust, rational trust, affinitive trust, systems-based trust, interpersonal trust, and procedural trust. I think a couple ones that are really important here are confidence, affinitive, and procedural. This confidence-based trust is the basis of the rational economic perspective. The truster looks at the trustee on past performance and benefits of the relationship, relying on information the truster can gather on the trustee to make an assessment. For affinitive trust, trust is built by the cultivation of meaningful personal relationships. This relationship-based understanding comes from social connectedness, positive shared experiences, shared identities, and assumptions of the similarity of shared values. And for procedural trust, this is trust built on the belief that procedures and rules are fair. All types of trust are definitely important to conservation. And the ones that I find important are not the same as those that operate in different spaces. If we would like to discuss them, we can, but I also am comfortable with moving on. Is there any other trust specific type you'd like to talk about, or can I move on?
Greg, I'm just curious on what dispositional trust is and how it differentiates from the rest of them.
Totally. Dispositional trust is based on the characteristics of the truster, describing the likelihood of trust. So confidence-based trust says, I know they can do it because they've proven in the past they can do it. Dispositional trust says, I trust them because I'm a trusting person, because I know trust works, because I know I can expect that. It comes from personal history and personalities of a particular person, establishing initial levels of trust in uncertain situations and shaping trust development. Essentially, when we have something like confidence-based trust or affinitive trust, or even procedural trust, we're thinking about something outside. Dispositional is based on the individual. So if you know that you're a very trusting person, I'm very gullible. If people tell me that orange is written on the ceiling in my own house, I'll be like, where? So that is just a disposition I am prone to versus a confidence based in someone else.
Hey, Greg, which one of these is evidentiary?
I think all of them have elements of that. Evidentiary trust is basically is rational trust. So a type of trust founded on the predicted behavior of the trustee, where the truster believes the likely outcome of the trustee's likely action. The truster expects utility from the trustee, an expectation that comes from economic traditions of trust. That kind of trust, the idea that you can have evidence to trust someone, comes mostly from monetary evaluation. It doesn't really exist in human-to-human relationships, at least in this research. So let's talk about the spectra of trust. Each type of trust exists on two separate spectra, which is the multiple word of spectrum. I did not know that until this presentation. First is the two different spectras. One is the positive trust that an individual has in another, and the other is the distrust one has in another. At each end of the spectrum lies a general lack of trust. Lack of trust is a situation in which the potential truster has inadequate information to make a judgment about whether to trust a potential trustee. Distrust is an explicitly negative expectation about the potential trustee. So if we're looking at something like interpersonal trust, where I depend on you and you depend on me, there's a world in which the lack of trust I have in an individual makes it hard for me to even get to a place of positive trust. And if that lack of trust is so strong, it becomes distrust, we're so far from being able to achieve an outcome that we have to first work on our relationship before we can even get to the issue at hand. Understanding trust requires us to understand the layer cake of who is trusted. It begins with the clarification that trust is noting something you do, is not something you do, but rather something you give to others. In this sense, trust is an attitude. Trust as an attitude, where trusters evaluate individuals, organizations, and collaboration to create a willingness to trust. That is within trust asymmetry. When trust is asymmetric, it can undermine the positive effect of trust by being costly for the individual expressing higher trust, and can trigger a vicious cycle of increasing distrust. All of these things lead to trusting behavior. Trust does not necessarily lead to trusting behavior. Trust is the willingness to be vulnerable rather than the act of being vulnerable. External forces affect whether individuals act on their trusting attitudes. This trust environment influences how likely it is that an individual will be willing to trust, which affects collaborative outcomes. And I think this is more to your point, Dad, because trust asymmetry is when the evidence shows that you can't trust someone the way you think you can. And that requires communication in the relationship. I said a lot there. Does anybody want to say anything? Is there any stumbling blocks? Anybody furious with me? No? Great. Love that. We're more like trust ecologies. To get to a trust ecology, we must travel through the realm of human ecology. Human ecology is where we explore the impact of ecocultural factors like national cultural norms, economic, political, and religious institutions, climates, and epidemics on the evolutionary theory of human cooperation. Natural selection appears to favor cooperation within small and enduring social groups. Within human ecology, we have political ecology. This element of human ecology examines power and traces control and influence that leads people to believe things. This influence and control have felt impacts through their framing and design of interventions. Trust ecology comes from this dissection of power. Within political ecology, Trust ecology looks at the key element of power, trust, taking a view of trust that includes different dimensions, diversity of reference points, as well as overall trust. It is insufficient to only consider the individual truster. We must regard them within their trust environment. Let's talk about trust diversity and the effects it has on institutional resilience. To have a strong trust environment, there are several elements that must exist. First, there must be trust diversity. Diverse trust creates resilience through trust redundancy. This redundancy allows for lost truth components to regrow. Management will be more resilient where multiple types of trust exists and are widely distributed. For example, having dispositional trust with your closest coworkers and procedural trust with your organization allows an individual to take risks without worrying about being punished. Next, we have richness and evenness. These terms are borrowed from environmental ecology. Trust richness refers to several different types of trust within a network. Trust evenness refers to the relative abundance of trust types within a network. Moving on to complacency points. Systems may reach a saturation point where the benefits of trust weaken. Too much trust has negative effects on institutional resilience and effectiveness. Near unlimited or total trust can demotivate participations, and participants may assume their involvement is unnecessary. Finally, the lack of trust. The presence of a little bit of lack of trust in small amounts is helpful in management institutions as they encourage participation, active deliberation, and infusion of innovative ideas. This is where the devil does need to have an advocate. Rarely will I ever say that. I really don't like it when people are like, well, to take the devil's argument here. No, he doesn't need an advocate. He usually does perfectly fine on his own. But at least in trust diversity and in trust ecology, it's necessary to have someone who says, I don't think that works for me. I don't think that works for this project. My mother will tell you she used to rip apart my papers with a red pen because she would be like, that doesn't make sense. And I don't trust that. My dad used to think, I don't believe what my son's saying right now. I'm going to distrust that. And he was right too, because I was trying to get out of something. Inclusion and trust in collaborative governance is kind of the key here. When we think about, as trust ecologies are context specific and abstract, we can look at those contexts and make the abstract elements less so to get a more complete picture. A key enabler is trust. It's a key enabler of adaptive governance, a collaborative decision-making system in which effective management can take place. Recently, there's been a shift to local institutions for governance of resource use, with an expected increase in democracy and accountability. This shift is not a panacea. I'm gonna try this one again. Recently, there has been a shift to local institutions for governance of resource use, with an expected increase in democracy and accountability. This shift is not a panacea for improving all outcomes, but successful engagement with different communities can lead to the development of effective responsibility and accountability, especially for communities with limited capacity. The challenge of social ecological systems, that is what SES stands for, improves natural resource government in challenging large, complex socio-ecological systems, since principles are derived from studies of small-scale, self-organizing, and community-based systems. These principles do not apply well in complex social-ecological systems that are large. An example of this is a community that has several million residents is not the same as a small-scale farming commune. Therefore, implementing the systems that worked on the small scale will not be successful on the large scale. Vulnerability is where agencies and organizations give trust to a community as a means of accepting vulnerability and giving up control and power over management. As of right now, dominant cultures continue to mistrust marginalized populations' relationship with nature, making vulnerability quite difficult. Which brings us to the problem with experts. Expert-driven answers are given to solve problems of distrust without disturbing the political status quo, even if this status quo may be causing distrust in the first place. The use of expert-only science validates certain forms of knowledge as acceptable while excluding others that could solve the same problems. Because this is all important for collaborative governance. These factors influence the ability of communities to engage people across the boundaries of public, private, and civic spheres. This collaborative approach requires principles engagement, shared motivation, and a capacity for joint action. Before I move on to repairing trust, I'd be interested if anyone has any comments to say at this point. And there's no limitations. Anybody can talk.
Touché on your governance overview, Greg. Nicely done.
Oh, thank you.
I have a question. How do you assess the trust environment with all of those? Like, I got overwhelmed. I'll be honest. I got overwhelmed with it. And so how do you assess the trust environment?
So when I'm talking about the trust environment, what I'm really talking about is what is the capacity of this group to trust me, if I'm being honest. And that requires fully investing myself in that conversation. So if I'm going through local institutions, I'm probably going to get a much more accurate reading of a trust ecology than I will if I go to my one-page paper on Rwanda. Let's say I'm going to the town of Musanze in northern Rwanda, and I need to know how they feel about trust, how they trust conservation organizations. I don't speak Rwandan, and I barely speak French. So I'm not able to talk to them. How am I going to get this information? Oh, I can go to a local institution, and I don't just mean like the bar. I mean like we just go to someone's like favorite restaurant and listen to people talk and go, you hear enough times, oh, I can't trust an NGO because they're blah, 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 blah. And then you see how many times that comes up. A really strong example of this is in Tanzania for a Red Plus program. They were trying to restore a forest. The leaders were not giving the inhabitants of the forest the money. They were stealing it for themselves. They were telling the organization it was all working out just fine. But the people on the ground were getting more and more frustrated and ended up breaking a lot of the rules because they weren't being respected. The trust couldn't be discussed between the leaders and the organization. It had to go one step back to the people on the ground. So when we think about the challenge of socio-ecological systems, where our social elements and our ecological elements are in cooperation or competition, those things reveal trust environments. And if we start with the largest, which is how do these people feel, then we go to how do these people feel right now, and then how do they feel right now about conservation, we're slowly narrowing the scope. This requires investment of time. This requires investment of resources. Two things that major organizations do not want to hear. They want to hear that it's easy, quick, and simple. And I think the difficulty is people then go, okay, I guess we'll give you quick and easy and simple. And they do really big galas, and then you get called a superstar of conservation, but there are people who are dying and they need your help. So the collaborative governance structure of like working with each other to build up effective institutions through redundancies of trust is probably the best way to do it. This is the most intellectually difficult conversation to have because trust is not something we explicitly discuss. We don't say, I trust this group X way. We say, I don't like them. Or they say, they're kind of nice. Or like me and my mom, when we would go grocery shopping when I still lived at home, if someone was kind of weird in the aisle, we would just kind of move to the next one and then just wait till they were gone and go back. And that technically is our dispositional trust to understand if we're okay with the same person in our aisle. We never talked to
Of course,
them.
they used to do that with us too, Greg. Remember?
Totally. Oh, absolutely. It's a two-way street. Oh no, I was dancing in the hallways. It could have been. They probably were terrified. No wonder it was always empty when we walked down hallways.
Sorry, I had to add that in.
It's important. You're helping me. That's actually really important. It's not just one way. The trust goes the other way as well. So you have your local organization being like, can we trust them? How do you even get into that conversation? How do you even to be like, hey, do you trust me? I know I'm not going to hurt you if you say no, but better not say no. Like it's like you can feel that pressure there, which actually brings us to our next conversation topic, repairing trust, the very thing we're trying to do. When repairing trust, people tend to listen to further their own distrust rather than hear evidence of trust. It's the long road to repair, but it can be taken. Trust repair efforts must overcome, hold on. Trust repair efforts must overcome negative expectations while simultaneously aiming to restore and create positive expectations about future trustworthiness. This requires congruence. It is important that there is a similarity between negative expectations and the methods to increase future trustworthiness. Dishonest impressions are largely ineffective and unsustainable. When the idea for a park was brought before the community, residents feared that jobs would go to an outside firm. The organization brought a local resident onto the board to ensure that the project took community's concerns as legitimate. This will lead to fair processes. Increasing trust through fair participatory processes is likely to make conflict resolution more likely. Lack of acknowledgement of conflict leads to increased frustration from other stakeholders. More inclusive and fair approaches allow decisions to be socially and politically accepted. Because this is the complex nature of trust. The complex nature of trust in conservation, where stakeholders have high levels of ecological knowledge, creates its own set of barriers to repairing trust. Concerns expressed by scientists and government organizations of bringing in local knowledge into management are linked into perceptions that local knowledge is somehow lacking scientific rigor or merit. To your point, Michelle, this is hard and overwhelming. That is kind of the point. It is not easy, and I wish we would talk about it as if it was hard and difficult and full of nuance. That is the issue I run into all of it. My mother has heard me say, I love nuance so much. It's my favorite thing in the world. Moving on to how trust and the perception of justice affects each other.
Hey, Gregory, I had a quick.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say on the previous slide, it also reminds me of when you were talking earlier, and because this process has to be emotion laden for sure. And so it goes back to the idea of like, it takes 4 times to overcome one bad experience. And so being able to like the complexity of just not negative expectations, but now we're in negative emotions. And so now we have to do, again, 4 times to overcome one negative experience in that space.
Totally. That's what I've come to realize is that when we put, and that's the next topic we're going to talk about, is perceptions of justice actually can reinforce the positive emotional aspects without directly approaching them. So when people are talking about trust issues, especially negative trust issues, you will quickly hear a laden list of emotional pain. You will go, they hurt me repeatedly, and they did not care about hurting me. Those things are impossible to tell them they're wrong. You can't tell them, no, they didn't, because they did. What you can say is, that was wrong, I won't do that. I can show you I won't do that through my actions, and I will consistently not do that. And you do that by not doing it. And that's where, like, if I was to create another slide of this, it would be the opposite direction, which is the road to reducing trust issues to their simplest bare bones essentials, which is there is an action that was taken that hurt an individual, and the individual has to be compensated. What that compensation is is up for discussion. And I think that justice is the best way to engage in that conversation, which brings us to trust.
Hey, Greg,
Oh.
that's a small question on your previous slide.
Yes.
Because first of all, I love it a lot. The higher idea that occurred to me was confidence, not because I could trust that you know what you're talking about, but I have no confidence that you'll be able to accomplish the objective. And I was just wondering whether that lineage fit into your thinking in some way.
Totally. And that's why it's a complex. That's why it's complex. The complex nature of trust says that you could have all of the positive expectations in the world. If I don't have the ability, or if you don't have the confidence in me to do it, we're still not there. And that's where, so trust is vulnerability. And that was what I originally wanted the whole presentation to be, but that's only one part of it. When we're vulnerable, that's where confidence comes in, because you can say, oh, wow, they were comfortable enough to be vulnerable in front of me. For example, I got at my job, they wanted me to go drive down to somewhere southeast of Pueblo to pick up refrigerators. That would have taken 12 hours of Greg's day, and I had to do 6 presentations and talk a lot. So I didn't really want to do that. And the panic I had about telling my boss no, he could see it on my face. He saw that my confidence in my saying no would be respected. As my mother will tell you, theater did not respect my boundaries. And because of that, I had to overcome my own negative expectations to come to a place of congruence so that I believe the process was fair, to acknowledge the complex nature of the trust that we had. So it's really hard to say in the moment when it's happening, but oh my God, you can see it when somebody else does it. Another really great example is Joe Biden. I love when he does this, when he gets sassy Joe Biden and he he makes fun of somebody. He always goes like, that's what they thought. And then reality was different. And that kind of trust in like what's going to happen is really difficult for people. We're going to get into that in the next conversation. Trust and the reparation and the perception of justice. Trust can be gained or lost in explicit relation to perceptions of justice. The process of trusting may shape perceptions of justice as well. Justice is a precondition for trust. Whether interests are included affects the decision to trust, which shapes perceptions of justice. Violations that compromise a truster's perceptions of justice reduce the perceptions of trustworthiness. So for example, a person's experiences of being on the receiving end of a discriminatory policy can drive feelings of fear, reducing their willingness to trust. Fair treatment ensures a willingness to trust. And the same can be true in the other direction. Perceived justice is an antecedent to trust. When we perceive a just system, it is the largest influence that shapes trust in conservation relationships. Distrust emerges when promises are not upheld. Example, legacies of oppression produce distrust to the marginalized, reducing their agency, wherein their trustworthiness is assumed. The identities recognized as having legitimacy come from the historical events and politics that shape trustworthiness, even to the trustworthiness of knowledge that comes to be what counts as science and expertise. Finally, trust as antecedent to perceptions of justice. Human agency is often constrained by norms, and people do not make decisions under selected circumstances. These decisions are made under circumstances already existing, given from the past, highlighting how power relationships affect environmental outcomes and perceptions of justice. Large organizations wield trustworthiness as an asset with a strong incentive to do this, as having power without being trusted reduces one's ability to influence. And that's the end of the presentation, but I know this is a confusing topic, and I don't want to pretend that I'm just rushing through it. I know that's I've said a lot there, so please go ahead, pick it apart, ask me questions. I got stories.
I have a question.
Yes.
Don't you think that rational trust and definitive trust is also interpersonal? I mean, don't you think there is an overlap in between those?
Oh, totally. I think a lot of these things they take place between individuals. It's hard not to trust yourself, even though that does exist in our common lexicon. I would say that when you have affinitive or you have dispositional trust, that's more specific to your relationship to someone else, not based in the specific relationship to someone else. So for example, I know my mother will pick up the phone call. Every time I call her, she'll pick it up. That's a dispositional trust I have. Affinitively, if someone's an actor, I assume we can both talk about what we did during a 5-minute break. I think that's where the difference is about how you relate to that other person. And then interpersonal trust in general is how do individuals relate to one another in a trusting dynamic. I think it's about the perspective you take in that trust.
Okay, thank you. By the way, it was a brilliant presentation.
Well, thank you so much. That's kind, Marcelo.
I still think you should consider doing a PhD and become a professor. Be a great professor.
No more school. No more school. No, no,
Okay.
no. I love my brain. I'm not going to do that to it anymore.
Greg.
Yes.
If trust is violated, how should we be thinking about repairing trust, particularly as it relates to conservation and things that might not have been delivered that were promised, and maybe as the driver behind our violation?
Okay, so I think it's a really important thing to talk about. And what I'm going to talk about is that justice is needed for trust and trustworthiness. So misrecognition strongly affects perceptions of trustworthiness, particularly in racialized settings. In sub-Saharan conservation workplaces, misrecognition of personhood through a construct of race has led to assumption that Black conservationists are more prone to corruption than their white colleagues and therefore cannot be trusted with finance-based or higher managerial positions. Legacies of colonialism and Orientalism produce barriers to seeing marginalized actors outside racialized lenses, reducing their agency and identities to a generalized category, wherein they're assumed to be untrustworthy. What we have done in conservation is we have systematized and we have institutionalized distrust of people who do not fit the oppressor's mind. If you do not think of the world as a utilitarian, sorry, it's a cat, that's funny. If you think of the world as being normal and not normal, you're creating distrust already. If you start saying that anyone here is capable of creating the outcome, you're opening up the possibilities. Because it goes the other way. Being socially categorized as coming from privilege also implies misrecognition and a similar challenge to actors' trustworthiness. For example, in Mozambique, a specific white worker who's from France said people don't trust a white foreigner poking around asking questions about poaching. And for good reason. Being white, many people believed I worked for the park, no matter how hard I and my research assistants tried to demonstrate otherwise. The social identities one recognizes as having social legitimacy and can trust are ingrained in the historical events, power dynamics, and politics that shape assumed trustworthiness. This is the issue that is at the heart of trust ecologies. When we rely on assumption, our trust is very shaky. And it requires human-to-human open communication, which is hard and time and money intensive, which we never have enough of. Which to me signifies that we've been putting our money, time, and resources into the wrong things, just from a purely like 30,000 foot view kind of way of thinking about it.
And Greg, I certainly can talk to this, but I want to get your thoughts on this. And this kind of goes back to an earlier question that Michelle asked as well. Assessing trust baseline while you're going through it and then afterwards to see if the actions were effective. What do you see as the role of social science in that space?
Social science is kind of in a hard spot, I think, sometimes, because it's kind of got a foot in both worlds. social science is aware of the fact that it's been created in a very specific context. So I think acknowledging that context is really important. So I often think about the example that always pops into my head is Rock Creek National Park is in Washington, D.C. It's in the center of the city, and it divides the city almost in half. It takes up a large swath of that area, but the social benefits to having a park in a major metropolitan area that is unlimited by humanity has incredible social benefit that has been seen time and time again in social research. And it doesn't come from, and you don't need to be a social scientist to see that, but it is there. And I think you probably can speak to this better than I can. I think you probably could do that better than I could. But the example that I have here is that the Virgin Islands National Park in St. John has a long history of conflict with local residents because they were so paternalistic about it. I think my hope is that if they put a more of a social science approach to it, you would see all of the different competing influences. You would see all of the competing, all the different things that apply to the perception of legitimacy and ability to trust. But you have probably better stories than I do.
Yeah, I mean, I think the only thing I'll add to that is that I know because we, as Gregory already knew, that we did trust ecologies here. Like what Gregory did expanded significantly on what I introduced to his class last semester. And so, but at Lacy Consulting, we definitely do a lot of social science work around trust with organizations. And so, for instance, looking at the levels of trust, a project we did in the Bahamas between fishers, law enforcement, and conservation groups in order for us to assess for them what is the current level of trust between those three different groups and how that impacts their work and how they can get things done and their trust in science, their trust in conservation organizations. So all of those things really play a factor. I'm not sure if you were going to use that case study in another example, but
No.
Okay.
I actually have a Great Barrier Reef example for this one. I was trying to find it for Michelle because she made a good point about this earlier. So the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park, which is actually outside of the Great Barrier, it's like right outside. They wanted to explore the factors that contributed to legitimacy among key direct resource users in the region: tourism operators and commercial fishers. These stakeholder groups represent important industries whose influence shapes policy and management. Trust was differentiated strongly, not by what job they have, but what kind of fishery they were, reflecting the likely formation of cohesive groups within resource users, sectors as a result of their shared working history and experience. It also is differentiated by region. So if you were to have a conversation with people in the Great Barrier Reef National Park and say, we know you use these things for these reasons, therefore you all have to do it that way, would probably not be taken very well. But if you went to a specific group of fishers and said, we know you do it this way, we see what you value, we see why you put the information the way you do, now we can approach it this way. It's taking the social science to, not force, that's the wrong way to put it, to guide the dissection. The words are hard, but the fishers who reported participation in a Reef Guardian program also reported higher trust in information received from the protected area than non-participants did, irrespective of the main fishery type. When we all bring them together, trust is a lot easier to create versus starting in all these disparate areas, because you can't pull everyone together. You could, I mean, it's really hard and requires a lot of energy. You can be like, hey, let's all learn about this thing together. And then it organically comes out. It's a lot of like, not work smarter, not harder. Like we need to, I think where social science actually really beneficial, we can implement social science practices through a more organic frame that can do, it happens organically. And that's actually really important because happening organically, you usually get better information than out of a standardized thing. And higher levels of trust seem to be correlated with cohesion and previous experience and proximity to sources of knowledge, resources, and decision-making. You can't just have one of these things. You got to have all of them. And we can't really prioritize, because when we prioritize, as we talked about during value framing, it can, I'm sorry about that. Loud teenagers. We have to be able to build like a redundancy. You have to build redundancy so that it can interweave itself and hold whatever the trusting object is. I think I did that right. Yeah.
Gregory, when I think of the social science stuff, at least, well, let me just refer back to some of the stuff that I did participated in back when I worked for the archery industry. Is, you know, we would get the results of some survey, and two things would happen. One, like if it's 60-40, it's automatically converted to 100-0, right? It's like 60% believe X, that means this is the truth, you know, and then and then part two is like, and that's a forever statement, when in actuality it's a moment in time. So what say ye regarding these two things?
Well, that's my whole shtick. Like so to your point about what you see in the social science, is that I hear that all the time. People tell me, especially my family, when they talk about political things, will say everyone believes X, and my internal social scientist brain is like, no, they don't. They don't say that at all. No one says that. No one says that even a little bit. But that is how anecdotally we talk about it. That's what the assumption is. And when we build a society based on assumption, like it's always in this process of having to like point at, it was built with those decisions. So at least from my perspective, as a person who passes with lots of privileges, I have a certain amount of agency to say, that doesn't work. I know that doesn't work. And the amount of arguments I've gotten in with boys named Tanner who drink a lot of alcohol and tell me I'm an idiot, I like to say to them, I'm going, well, who made you king? And who made you the system maker? Why is that the thing we're using? And they go, well, it's what we've always done. And part of me is like, but no, it's not. That's not true. Like, so this is one of the hardest. I think the two presentations we're doing right now, value framing and trust ecologies, are the hardest, because these are the core problems we're having. People don't have trust, and they don't understand the values that are being framed. And when we try to go, okay, but you do trust some things, and they go, but I don't trust everything. For example, if someone thinks that the government is good because they stop criminals, but also thinks the government is bad because they want to put restrictions on guns, that's a seeming contradiction in how they view safety. But if you ask them further, you get like this like division of like, I don't see those two things as connected. I don't need to see them as connected because they benefit me. Why would I do that? Other people who see them a different way, I don't have to agree with them. I can live in my own reality. Have you been in Kansas? There's like, yes, cognitive dissonance. Have you been to Kansas? Everyone there thinks they need to have a 12-gauge shotgun every time they go have a conversation with somebody. And it's like, you're not running down bear. What are you doing? What are you so scared of? And if you go further down that question, and it's why I wish I could be a bit more aggressive, I mean, as I am right now, and be like, why do you care so much? What is the benefit here? And if they can answer that question, oh my God, you get so much. I think you get so much. If I answered your question correctly, I think. If I did, I'm sorry, Michelle, did I? Okay, good. All right, and then to wrap it up, I just want to tell this quick story about a collaborative problem solving, because I do believe these are collaborative issues that can be solved collaboratively. To reach agreement on what management actions are appropriate for collaborative land management in the United States Forest Service, collaborators must develop a shared vision of what a restored landscape looks like, and come to agreement on the steps that will achieve that vision of restoration based on shared goals for collaboration identified objectives as recreation, timber, wildlife risk mitigation. This is connecting consensus to collaborative problem solving. That is the difference according to me. Consensus means outcome by any means. Collaborative problem solving means we're being brought together to create an outcome. And that's where I want to end this one. We can take a little 8-minute break. I've been doing here a lot, and I need to go drink more water. All right, thank you so much. I'll be back in about 8 minutes. How do I end this?